Hi, I'm Chris Sangster, and welcome back to the studio. Today, I want to show you how to set up a professional mix bus signal chain using only stock plugins available in Logic Pro. As I've said before, how you use your tools is far more important than the specific tools that you use. And it is totally possible to get professional results in mixing using only stock plugins in Logic Pro. You just have to use them effectively and have a reliable process. And as part of my mixing process, I set up the plugins on my mix bus in a very deliberate way and at a very specific point in the process. So let's look at where I am in this mix. You see that I have no plugins on any of the individual tracks. In fact, all I've done so far is set the volume fader and pan positions for each track. That's how I start every mix, by mixing the song using only the volume faders and pan knobs. After that, I move on to my mix bus. This is something called top-down mixing, where you start by mixing at the highest level of your signal routing hierarchy. And since all of the tracks in the session are ending up at the mix bus, we start by putting plugins there. This has a few advantages. For starters, it allows you to get your song sounding really good really quickly. With just a few plugins on the mix bus, we can get a head start on the mix and have things sounding solid right out the gate. The second benefit is that the plugins on the mix bus will affect every other mixing decision you make. Since all of the tracks are always going through those plugins, they will affect the sound of every plugin you put on an individual track. Therefore, it's best to set them up first and mix through them. This prevents you from going in circles tweaking plugins, which can easily happen if you try to put plugins on the mix bus later in the mixing process. I actually have an extra routing level that I mix through called the sub-mix auxes. That's these tracks here, and all of the associated individual tracks are first routed to these, and then these are routed here to my mix bus. I do this because I like to be able to make macro changes to larger groups of instruments to fine-tune my mix. Do note that I set up a separate aux track for my mix bus, and I do not use the default stereo output aux. I do this because I like to have that default aux open for metering and my SonarWorks Room EQ plugin. But you can use the default pink track as your mix bus if you want. Now, I always mix through a limiter, and it will always be in the last plugin slot on my mix bus. It helps me mix at a level that's a bit louder and closer to the master level, but its main job is to prevent clipping on the mix bus. So let's start by putting the adaptive limiter on the last slot of the mix bus. A fairly simple setup. I'm gonna turn the output ceiling down to -1 to guarantee that there's no clipping, and I'll set the gain to 2, just so we get a little bit of a level boost. I'll also turn true peak detection on because that's what will be used in the mastering stage, and I want this to approximate a mastering limiter as best as it can. The goal is to prevent clipping, but also to help me mix with the mastering process in mind, so that there are not large changes needed when it comes time to master the song. To make our decisions about the plugins on the mix bus and their settings, we're gonna work on the biggest, loudest section of the song, the place where the majority of the tracks in the session are playing. In this song, that's the last chorus, so let's create a cycle range for that section. The first plugin on my mix bus will always be some type of console emulation. I do this because I want some analog saturation on the tracks right away. This helps to give some color to the sound and eliminates that digital blandness. The goal is not to add distortion, but just a gentle amount of saturation and color to the sound. And to do this with Logic stock plugins, we'll use Chroma Glow. Do note you need an M1 Mac or later to use this plugin. Super simple here, we're gonna use a preset. It's one called Mix Magic. It sounds great as it is and adds the amount of saturation I'm looking for without distorting. Next up, I'm gonna add a compressor. For mix bus compression, I love using an emulation of the SSL bus compressor. And thankfully, we have one of those available to us in Logic Pro. Call up the stock compressor plugin and switch to the vintage VCA style. For the compressor settings, I'm going to start with a 2:1 ratio. Sometimes I'll go down to 1.5:1 if the song is really dense, but 2:1 is usually the sweet spot. Make sure that auto makeup gain is turned off, as we'll add our own amount of makeup gain in a moment. I always start out with a very slow 100 millisecond attack time. This is usually where I'll leave it, but I'll always audition different attack times to find which one works best for the song. About 95% of the time, I'm going to use auto release, as it sounds the most musical to me on mixed bus compression in all but the most extreme cases. One thing we need to be aware of when using the Logic stock compressor is that in order to get the full color and saturation from the analog compressor emulation portion of the plugin, we need to turn on the distortion knob. And for mixed bus compression, I always use soft because it adds a nice color but no audible distortion. The distortion knob does, however, add a significant amount of gain to the signal, so I'll just turn the output down by -3 dBs to compensate. I'm okay with having the mixed bus compressor add a little bit of level to the overall signal, but I want to do that more precisely with the makeup gain. Next, we'll come to the sidechain menu and set up an EQ on the internal sidechain. This will affect the signal that the compressor hears and therefore reacts to. We will not hear the results of this EQ, only the compressor will, and it will change how the compressor reacts. What we do here is to first turn the sidechain filter on, then switch the type to HP, high pass, then set the frequency to 60 Hz. What this does is roll off everything below 60 Hz in the detector path of the compressor. It basically adds this type of EQ to the signal that the compressor is listening to. Because compressors tend to react more strongly to low end, rolling it off on the sidechain means the compressor will not overcompress the mix. The name of the game with mixed bus compression is subtlety. We want a gentle gluing effect, not a pumping hard compression effect. And adding the high pass filter to the sidechain is a key way to do this, especially in modern music that has lots of sub-bass information. Now that we have the basic setup of the compressor, let's hit play and adjust the threshold until we're getting between 1 and 2 dBs of gain reduction. Remember, be subtle here. After we've set the threshold for the correct amount of gain reduction, we can then audition our different attack times. You can certainly just tweak the knob as the song plays, but I like to listen to 4 different specific attack times: 100, 50, 30, and 10 milliseconds. And what I'm listening for is how the different attack times change the balance of the instruments. We want to find the one that makes things sound as balanced and glued together as possible. In this song, as the attack gets faster, I notice the vocals being pushed further back into the mix and the percussion, especially those shakers, coming forward in the mix. You can really hear it on 10 milliseconds. The balance is just totally off. For that reason, I'm gonna stick with a 100 millisecond attack time. Once those things are set up, we can then use the makeup gain to compensate for the gain reduction. I generally am gonna add about 1 to 2 dBs of makeup gain just to compensate for the gain reduction and add just a touch of overall level to the signal. spot in my mix bus signal chain is reserved for some type of tape machine emulation. This is adding even more of that analog saturation and color. And this is the one that really gives the mix a wow factor. It's the one when you turn it on, you say, yeah, that sounds like a real record now. We don't need expensive analog hardware to get that effect. But the truth is, we need to add some type of non-linearity into our digital signal. The secret sauce of analog gear comes down to, in my opinion, the element of randomness that is introduced into the signal by those electrons moving through physical components. That's lost when music is reduced to ones and zeros in a digital audio workstation. But thankfully, we have a ton of plugins that can add that randomness, that non-linear special sauce back into our signal so our mixes can sound the way we expect music to sound. And for our tape machine emulation, we are again going to reach for Chroma Glow. But this time, let's set it up manually. The perfect model for tape machine emulation is, of course, magnetic. And I like it on the colorful style. Let's hit play and nudge the drive up until we get a nice sound. Uh-oh, right away it's distorting way too much. And this is because of the low end. Luckily, Chroma Glow has a sidechain high-pass filter built right in with this bypass below button. Enabling this does the exact same thing as the sidechain filter on the compressor does. The plugin does not hear the low end of the signal and therefore does not apply saturation in response to it, allowing us to turn up the drive knob further before hearing obvious distortion. The default setting of 120 Hz seems to work well for this song. So let's turn the drive up again with bypass below enabled. I like it around 8%. Just feels right to me there. Not overly distorted, but it's definitely adding that extra punch and depth that I'm looking for. It feels like the lows are lower and the highs are higher, and that's exactly what I want out of tape emulation. And finally, we have the option of adding some EQ. This will be very song dependent, but generally a bit of high-end boost with a high shelf and a scoop to the mid-range can help the song sound more balanced and exciting. But the exact frequencies that you're gonna EQ are gonna be completely dependent upon the song. Subtlety is again key here. You only want to do boosts or cuts of 1 to 2 dBs max, as you just want a small enhancement here, not a big change. The majority of the EQ cleanup work should still be done on the individual tracks. There we go, that's how I set up my mix bus every time I mix. Console emulation, compression, tape emulation, EQ, limiter. And we have all of that available to us as stock plugins in Logic Pro. Let's check out the before and after. Hopefully you'll agree the song sounds bigger, punchier, and much closer to a finished mix, all with 5 simple plugins. Of course, this is just the start, but it is a great start, one that will lead us to success during the other steps of the mixing process. And if you want to learn every step of that mixing process, one that I have developed over the last decade to get consistent professional results mixing music of all genres, then hit the link in the description box below the like button. My flagship mixing course, Mixing Decoded, is launching on Monday, and you'll be the first to get your hands on it if you sign up at the link below. And just between you and me, there may or may not be a 15% discount on it for the next 2 weeks. Just saying. As always, drop a comment below if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the studio next time. Thanks.